Our thoughts go really to the family of Abdel Basher. He had been working for 10 years with the ICRC. He's father to 8 children, and he's dead. He was unarmed, he was defenseless. He was protecting a compound from where, I can tell you, hundreds of thousands of Afghans were getting valuable services. And he is no more, and we're very sad for it. Yesterday, in the afternoon, 4 men, 2 wearing suicide vests, attacked the ICRC compound in Jalalabad, which is the capital city of the Ningarra province in the eastern part of the country. And the outcome was the death of one of our colleagues, an Afghan. 2 hours later, the attackers were dead, and all our people were regrouped. It is a brutal, despicable, and frankly, from our viewpoint, very senseless attack against an organization that has been present in Afghanistan for the past 30 years. There isn't a single Afghan that wouldn't recognize the fact that we are strictly independent and humanitarian in what we do. So there is a lot of incomprehension about why 4 people would actually kill themselves to attack an unprotected structure of a strictly humanitarian organization like ours. All movements have been frozen throughout Afghanistan. There is not a single ICRC delegate or employee that is moving, taking the roads today in Afghanistan. Our subdelegation in Jalalabad has been closed. So we are reconnecting with the government, we are reconnecting with the armed opposition as well, to try and determine exactly what happened and why. It was clearly a planned attack with a level of organization and means that rules out a kind of isolated incident by some individual. It has always been dangerous to be a humanitarian operator in Afghanistan. There is a long series of very serious incidents. We have also paid the price of blood in Afghanistan in past years. It has been dangerous, it is dangerous, and these attack and the quality of this attack compel us precisely to redefine the level of dangerosity there is for humanitarian players and for us to operate in the area.
I wanted to ask you about Brzezinski's famous comments to a French newspaper years ago when talking about why the Soviets even entered Afghanistan, the U.S. wanting to embroil them in their own kind of Vietnam, saying what's a few riled-up Muslims, and so the U.S. supporting the Mujahideen, among them that were trained was Osama bin Laden, and then the blowback effect afterwards. First they set their sights on the Soviet Union, then they set their sights on the United States. But how the Soviet Union first went in, take us through that whole trajectory, as you were just describing, when Gorbachev decided to pull out, and then the U.S. getting involved themselves and what the alternative was and is.
Well, that's really the incredible thing, because the Americans know what happened when the Russians were there, because they were arming the Mujahideen. And so then to invade themselves and think that they could do it differently from the Russians is just absurd. I mean, it is just crazy. The real problem was that they conflated the Taliban and al-Qaeda. It was a marriage of convenience between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. And as soon as 9/11 happened, Osama bin Laden moved from his Kandahar area, where he was relatively visible, to the Tora Bora Mountains. So that when Bush came along and said to the Taliban, you have got to hand Osama over to us or we're going to invade, it was a completely unrealistic demand. I mean, it's taken the United States 9 years to find Osama. How could the Taliban, who don't have night vision equipment, don't have satellites, don't have drones, how could they have located him in Tora Bora at that stage? It was completely unreal. Osama was out of their control.
Not to mention, ultimately, out of their country.
And then, of course, he moved out of the country, and al-Qaeda's been dispersed. It's stronger than it was in 2001 because they've got more recruits, partly because of these constant invasions, Iraq and Afghanistan, that fires people up and gets them angry.
You say al-Qaeda is stronger than it was in 2001?
Well, I think it's got more people around. And it's dispersed. It's in Pakistan, it's in Somalia, it's in Yemen, it's in North Africa. It was in Iraq for a time during the last 5 years, and so I think it's got more recruits. Maybe they're not as effective as they were, and certainly Homeland Security is much better. And that's what the reaction to 9/11 should have been: improve Homeland Security, but don't start intervening in Afghanistan.
What do the Taliban want now?
The Taliban, I think, have changed their line enormously. Mullah Muhammad Omar, at the end of Ramadan 6 weeks or so ago, put out a very important statement in which he said in terms, we do not want a monopoly of power in Afghanistan. That's a complete change. In 1996, when they came in, they did have that. He said, we respect all the ethnicities of Afghanistan and we want them to develop together. He represents largely a Pashtun constituency, and the Tajiks, who are the other second largest ethnicity, are quite worried. But from what Omar is saying, he's trying to reassure them. He even talked about foreign investment, bringing in investment. He said, we've got mineral wealth and so on, it must be developed. So he's completely changed his line. So I think he wants to come into a process of talks, and I think this is really what needs to happen now. I think Obama should now make a declaration that there's going to be a complete change of course, that the war is unwinnable, we are now moving towards negotiations, and that our goal now is a government of national unity in Afghanistan, which will include all the insurgent groups, every kind of group, and that it will make a pledge, of course, that it will not harbour al-Qaeda or any other global terrorist group in its country. And I think he has to lift the bounty on Mullah Muhammad Omar's head. You cannot negotiate with somebody if you're threatening to kill them and to give ransom, to give money to people who arrest him. So he has to really make a completely radical shift in policy and recognise that the interlocutor on the Taliban side has to be Mullah Muhammad Omar, or whoever he chooses to appoint as his negotiator.
And who is Mullah Muhammad Omar?
He is somebody who grew up in the resistance to the Soviet Union. He was part of the jihad, as they called it at that time, the mujahideen against the Russians. But he was of a younger generation from the Kandahar area. And like many of these young fundamentalists who fought against the occupier in the 1980s, which was the Russians, he became very disillusioned with the older generation when they finally took power in 1992, because they started a terrible civil war in Kabul. 50,000 people were killed just by shelling from one district of another of Kabul. And there was a lot of corruption. And Mullah Muhammad Omar was really one of these sort of young Puritans, if you like, who said, you know, we want to clean out these corrupt leaders and bring in a more honest and legitimate kind of Islam. Of course, they're very hard line in terms of women's rights, and nobody can, you know, accept that. But that doesn't start with the Taliban. The whole point that I'm trying to make in this book, which confronts 13 well-held Western myths about Afghanistan, is that women's oppression long predated the Taliban, unfortunately, and it's continuing in areas of Afghanistan where the Taliban have no control at all. So this is a fundamental traditional policy or practice and custom which will take a long time to change and move forward. But it's not as though the Taliban came in and started women's oppression.
And yet it is so often used in the United States as the reason the U.S. cannot leave. President Bush's his wife, the First Lady Laura Bush, talked about Afghanistan, the United States being there to free women, and that continues through to this day.
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether it was done entirely cynically, but if you follow the kind of scenario I laid out at the beginning, that they were really trying to go after al-Qaeda, but they knew it was going to be difficult. They thought it was an easy hit to get rid of the Taliban because they were a sitting target. So instead of hitting the bullseye, they knew that the dart would go somewhere on the board, and that was good enough because they could say, okay, we've toppled the Taliban, we've liberated women, they're throwing off the burqa, everything's fine, we're bringing humanitarian conditions and development to Afghanistan, and that would pacify the anti-war opposition. And in fact, it did, of course. Many people said, well, okay, they haven't found Osama, but at least it's better for Afghans. And I think if you talk to Afghans now, as I do, you know, they have very mixed feelings about that. Even women now, many of them are saying that the fundamental thing in Afghanistan is security, to get away from these car bombs, suicide attacks, drone attacks, and so on, and the war everywhere, and particularly in the villages. And that is the overriding thing, is to have peace, because peace is the biggest human right, and it covers all genders, both genders.
Jonathan Steele, columnist for The Guardian in Britain, roving foreign correspondent and author. In addition to Afghanistan, he's reported from Iraq as well as on the Israel-Palestine conflict. His latest book is called Ghosts of Afghanistan, The Haunted Battleground.